March 18, 1945. Kyushu, Japan. The morning sun breaks through scattered clouds over Kagoshima Bay, painting the water in shades of copper and gold. Lieutenant Takashi Yamamoto sits in the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, hands resting on the control stick, feeling the aircraft tremble beneath him as the engine warms. The smell of high-octane fuel and hot metal fills his nostrils, familiar scents that have accompanied him through 47 combat missions. Around him, 11 other Zeros prepare for takeoff from Kanoya Air Base, their propellers beginning to spin, catching the light like deadly flowers opening to the dawn. The briefing was simple: intercept the American bomber formation approaching from the south, protect the mainland, die if necessary. Takashi has made peace with death. What he has not prepared for, what no amount of training or Bushido philosophy has equipped him to face, is the weapon he will encounter in 17 minutes. He advances the throttle. The Zero accelerates down the runway, light and responsive, the most maneuverable fighter aircraft in the world when it first appeared over China in 1940. Takashi loves this machine with the devotion some men reserve for family. It responds to his touch like an extension of his own body, climbs like a rocket, turns inside any American fighter. He has heard the stories filtering back from the Pacific, stories about new American aircraft, about tactics that negate the Zero's advantages. But here, in his cockpit, with the ground falling away and the sky opening before him, he feels invincible. The Zero was designed for this moment. He was designed for this moment. 17 minutes later, at 12,000 feet over the Osumi Strait, Takashi Yamamoto encounters the future. The American formation appears first as dark specks against the southern horizon, then resolves into dozens of bombers, B-29 superfortresses, flying in their characteristic box formations. The Zeros climb to attack from above and behind, textbook tactics honed through years of combat. Takashi selects his target, AB-29 on the formation's edge, begins his diving approach. His thumb moves toward the firing button. Then the escorting fighters appear. They are Corsairs, the gull-winged American fighters that have dominated Pacific skies since 1943. Takashi has fought Corsairs before, knows their advantages: speed, firepower, rugged construction. He knows also their limitation: they cannot match the Zero's turning radius. The dogfight begins with the ancient choreography of aerial combat, diving attacks, climbing spirals, the geometry of pursuit and evasion. Takashi forces a Corsair into a turning fight, begins to gain the advantage. The American pilot, recognizing the danger, does something unexpected. Instead of continuing the turn, the Corsair rolls level and accelerates away. Not fleeing, but repositioning. And beneath its wings, Takashi sees objects he does not immediately recognize. Tubular rails, and mounted on those rails, what appear to be small bombs or fuel tanks. The Corsair comes around in a wide arc, maintaining distance. Takashi turns to intercept, calculating angles and speeds with the instinct of a predator. Then the American fighter's wings erupt in smoke and flame, not from bullet impacts, but from launch rails beneath the wings. 5 objects detach almost simultaneously, trailing white smoke, accelerating impossibly fast. Not falling like bombs. Not flying like aircraft. Moving with a speed and purpose that defies everything Takashi understands about aerial weapons. Moving directly toward him. He has perhaps 2 seconds to react. His mind, trained to calculate deflection angles and closure rates, cannot process what he is seeing. The objects are too fast, closing at combined speeds exceeding 700 miles per hour. He throws the Zero into a desperate roll, pulls back on the stick with all his strength. The aircraft responds instantly, turning with the agility that should save him. But these weapons do not require precise aim. They do not follow ballistic trajectories. They are rockets, 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, VARs, and one of them passes so close to Takashi's canopy that he can see the markings stenciled on its body before it explodes 70 feet ahead of him. The shockwave hits like a physical blow. The Zero shudders, yaws violently. Shrapnel punctures the thin aluminum skin, and suddenly the cockpit fills with smoke and the scream of torn metal. The engine coughs, loses power. Takashi fights the controls, but the aircraft no longer responds with its former grace. Something fundamental has broken. He is at 11,000 feet, losing altitude, his wings damaged, hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines. Below him, the Osumi Strait glitters in the morning sun. Behind him, The battle continues. More rocket launches, more smoke trails, more Zeros tumbling from the sky in flames. He nurses his crippled aircraft toward land, knowing that even if he survives, something essential has died. The belief that skill and courage and the world's most maneuverable fighter can overcome American technological supremacy. To understand the terror that Takashi Yamamoto experienced in those 2 seconds, one must travel backward through the war, through the evolution of aerial combat doctrine, through the gradual American realization that defeating Japanese fighters required not merely better pilots or better aircraft, but entirely new categories of weapons. The story begins not with rockets but with guns, and with the frustrating discovery that traditional aerial gunnery could not reliably kill the enemy. December 1941. The Zero fighter dominates the Pacific skies with a performance envelope that shocks American planners. Captured intelligence reports and combat observations reveal an aircraft of stunning capability. Maximum speed of 330 miles per hour, climb rate of 3,000 feet per minute, operational ceiling above 33,000 feet, and most importantly, a turning radius that allows it to outmaneuver any Allied fighter. The Zero achieves this performance through radical weight reduction. It carries no armor plating to protect the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal structural reinforcement. It is, essentially, a very powerful engine wrapped in the thinnest possible airframe, optimized entirely for performance at the expense of survivability. This design philosophy reflects Japanese tactical doctrine. The pilot's skill and the aircraft's agility matter more than protective measures. A true warrior does not require armor. American pilots, flying Wildcats and later Hellcats, learn quickly that dogfighting Zeros on Japanese terms equals suicide. The American fighters cannot outturn the Zero. Standard fighter tactics: get on the enemy's tail, stay there, shoot him down. Don't work against an opponent who can simply turn inside your turning radius and reverse the situation. The Americans adapt through tactics: dive attacks using superior speed, team fighting, refusal to engage in turning battles. These tactics work, but they're defensive, predicated on avoiding the Zero's strengths rather than exploiting its weaknesses. American pilots shoot down Zeros, but the kill ratios are not overwhelming, and each engagement requires significant tactical advantage. The fundamental problem persists. Killing a Zero with machine gun fire requires sustained accurate fire on a highly maneuverable target that presents minimal profile and can absorb surprising damage to non-critical areas. The arithmetic is discouraging. Analysis of gun camera footage and combat reports reveals that American fighter pilots fire, on average, approximately 1,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition for each confirmed kill. Some of this reflects missed shots. Aerial gunnery is extraordinarily difficult, requiring the pilot to calculate deflection angles while flying his own aircraft at high speed, often under G-forces that blur vision and impair judgment. But much of it reflects the simple difficulty of inflicting critical damage on an evasive target. A fighter aircraft contains relatively few truly critical systems: the engine, the pilot, the control surfaces, the fuel system. Hitting any of these systems reliably requires either extraordinary marksmanship or sustained fire that walks rounds through the target. Against a maneuvering Zero, sustained fire is nearly impossible. The U.S. Navy Bureau of Ordnance begins exploring alternatives in 1942. If guns require sustained accurate fire to achieve kills, perhaps a weapon requiring less accuracy but delivering more destructive power would prove more effective. The concept is not new. Ground attack aircraft have carried bombs and air-to-ground rockets since World War I. But those weapons were large, heavy, draggy appendages that destroyed an aircraft's performance. What the Navy requires is something different: a rocket small enough and aerodynamic enough to carry multiple rounds without crippling the carrier aircraft's speed or maneuverability, yet powerful enough to destroy an enemy fighter with a near miss. The weapon must be devastating but not debilitating to carry. The development program proceeds through 1943 with typical American systematic efficiency. Multiple designs are tested, evaluated, and refined. The winning design emerges as the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, HVAR in military terminology, Holy Moses in pilot slang. The name reflects both its power and the psychological impact on those who first witness it. The rocket measures 5 inches in diameter, 68 inches long, and weighs 134 pounds, including the 60-pound high-explosive warhead. It accelerates to 1,375 feet per second within 1 second of launch, far faster than any artillery shell, faster than most bullets. A single HVAR carries roughly the same high explosive content as a 5-inch naval gun shell. A Corsair fighter equipped with 8 VARs carries more explosive firepower than a destroyer's gun can deliver in a sustained engagement. But specifications on paper translate to tactical effectiveness only through careful integration. The rockets require specialized underwing rails, electrical firing systems, ballistic computers, or at least trained pilots who can estimate trajectory and lead time. Early testing reveals problems. The rocket's smoke trail blinds the pilot, the recoil affects aim, the ballistic arc differs significantly from bullet trajectories that pilots have trained their entire careers to estimate. The rockets are devastatingly powerful and nearly impossible to aim effectively. Through late 1943 and early 1944, Navy and Marine pilots train with the new weapon, learning its peculiar requirements. They discover that VARs work best not as precision weapons but as area effect weapons. Fire multiple rockets in a spread pattern at a target area. One or more will pass close enough for the blast to damage or destroy the target. The tactic requires unlearning conventional gunnery doctrine. Instead of aim small, miss small, the HVAR philosophy is aim at the general area, let explosive radius do the work. The Japanese High Command receives intelligence reports about American rocket development through 1944, but the reports fail to convey the weapon's psychological impact. Intelligence analysts, focused on measurable capabilities, document the rocket speed, explosive power, range. What they cannot document, cannot quantify, is the existential terror of facing a weapon that you cannot evade. Japanese fighter tactics, refined through years of combat, assume that a skilled pilot in a maneuverable aircraft can dodge or evade any attack if he sees it coming. Situational awareness plus aircraft performance equals survival. This formula has worked since the beginning of aerial combat. The HVAR breaks this formula completely. The rockets begin appearing in combat in significant numbers during the Philippines campaign in late 1944. Japanese pilots report encounters with American fighters carrying aerial artillery or flying bombs. The descriptions vary, but the consistent element is speed. Weapons that close faster than thought allows reaction. A Zero pilot who sees a Corsair fire its machine guns has time to maneuver, to roll, to evade. The tracers arc across the sky slowly enough that human reflexes can respond. But a pilot who sees HVAR launch smoke has no time. The rockets cross the intervening distance in seconds or less, arrive before cognitive processing completes, explode with sufficient blast radius that perfect evasion is impossible even if time permitted. The psychological transformation is profound. Japanese fighter pilots, raised in a military culture that emphasizes spirit over material, that teaches that willpower and skill can overcome technical disadvantage, encounter a weapon that renders spirit irrelevant. You cannot outspirit a rocket traveling 1,400 feet per second. You cannot use superior tactics against a weapon with such enormous blast radius that precise evasion is meaningless. The VARs reduce aerial combat from an arena of skill to simple mathematics. Can you avoid being in the general area where the rockets explode? Usually, the answer is no. Takashi Yamamoto's experience on March 18, 1945, represents the typical pattern. American fighter doctrine by this point has evolved to maximize HVAR effectiveness. Corsair and Hellcat pilots no longer attempt the traditional dogfight. They maintain speed and altitude advantage, use their superior power-to-weight ratio to control engagement geometry, fire rockets from medium range, 1,000 to 2,000 feet, while maintaining relative motion that makes return fire difficult. The tactics are conservative, emphasizing survival over glory, systematic destruction over honorable combat. They are profoundly un-Japanese in philosophy, which is precisely why they work. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In the first 3 months of 1945, American fighters equipped with VARs achieve kill ratios approaching 10-to-1 in air-to-air combat over Japan and the remaining Pacific strongholds. This figure represents not American fighters destroyed versus Japanese fighters destroyed, but the comparative loss rates. 10 Japanese fighters lost for every American fighter lost. The ratio reflects multiple factors: superior American pilot training, better aircraft performance, overwhelming numerical advantage, but after-action analysis consistently highlights VARs as a critical force multiplier. Pilots report that firing a salvo of 8 rockets at a formation of enemy fighters typically results in multiple kills or crippling damage to several aircraft, even if only 1 or 2 rockets achieve proximity hits. The blast pattern creates a zone of destruction that makes formation flying suicidal. Japanese pilots, recognizing the impossibility of surviving conventional engagement with rocket-armed American fighters, begin adopting increasingly desperate tactics. Some attempt to close to knife fighting range, accepting that they will absorb rocket fire during approach in hopes of reaching machine gun range where their maneuverability provides advantage. This tactic works occasionally but carries catastrophic loss rates. Others attempt to avoid combat entirely, diving away at maximum speed when American fighters appear. This preserves aircraft but abandons the mission. Still others embrace the logical conclusion of impossible odds, kamikaze attacks, where the aircraft itself becomes the weapon and survival is not expected. The progression from conventional combat to suicide tactics reflects the psychological breakdown of fighter-pilot culture under pressure from weapons that cannot be fought with traditional methods. The symbolic weight of the wing-mounted launch rails becomes, for Japanese pilots who survive combat encounters, a vision that recurs in nightmares. Multiple accounts from post-war interviews describe the same image: American fighter wings erupting in smoke, white rocket trails converging, the impossibility of evasion. The launch rails themselves, simple tubular structures bolted beneath the wings, represent American material abundance and technical sophistication. Japan, struggling to produce sufficient conventional fighters, cannot spare industrial capacity for specialized weapons research. Japanese rockets exist, developed for ground attack roles, but they are crude, unreliable, produced in insufficient quantities. The thought of mounting 8 sophisticated rockets on each fighter aircraft, of having sufficient production capacity to equip entire squadrons with weapons that costs as much as some aircraft, never seriously occurs to Japanese planners. The VARs represent not merely technical achievement but economic power that Japan cannot begin to match. Consider the production numbers. By war's end, American industry has manufactured over 1.3 million VARs. This figure represents rockets alone, not the aircraft to carry them, not the launch rails and firing systems, not the training programs and logistics networks required to deliver rockets to frontline units across the Pacific. The Americans have produced enough rockets to arm every fighter aircraft in the entire Japanese military inventory, if Japan possessed such aircraft, multiple times over. The contrast with Japanese production is almost absurd. Japan's entire rocket production for military use during the war totals perhaps tens of thousands of units, most of them ground-to-ground or ground-to-air systems, most of them unreliable. The Americans treat VARs as consumable munitions, fire them by the thousands in single engagements, restock from supply ships that carry replacement rockets the way other navies carry replacement ammunition. The Japanese treat every aircraft, every weapon, as irreplaceable. The Battle of Okinawa in April and May 1945 provides the culminating demonstration of HVAR effectiveness. American carrier aircraft, supporting the ground invasion, encounter hundreds of Japanese fighters attempting to attack the fleet or American ground forces. The Japanese throw everything remaining into these attacks: experienced pilots in Zeros and Oscars, novice pilots in obsolete aircraft, kamikaze units expecting to die. American fighters, flying from carriers offshore, establish air superiority not through dogfighting but through systematic destruction enabled by rockets. Combat camera footage from this period shows the tactic in clinical detail: American fighters approaching Japanese formations, maintaining speed and standoff distance, firing rocket salvos that bracket entire sections of the enemy formation, turning away before return fire becomes effective. The footage shows Japanese aircraft exploding, tumbling, disintegrating in mid-air. What the footage cannot capture is the psychological experience of Japanese pilots watching their squadron mates vanish in instantaneous fireballs, knowing that their own death approaches at 1,400 feet per second. Survival accounts from Japanese pilots who flew during the Okinawa campaign reveal a consistent narrative arc: initial confidence rooted in training and Bushido philosophy, first encounter with VARs producing shock and confusion, subsequent encounters producing terror and acceptance of death, final flights conducted with the fatalism of condemned men. One pilot, Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, describes his last combat mission in April 1945. "We saw the American fighters below us, climbing to intercept. I knew what would come. The smoke from beneath their wings, the white trails, the explosions that turned aircraft into scrap metal. I had seen it before. There was no defense, no tactic that worked. You could only fly into the rockets and hope that your spirit would carry you through, though you knew it would not. We attacked anyway because orders required it, because honor required it, but we knew we were dead already." The VAR's tactical dominance extends beyond direct combat effectiveness. The mere presence of rocket-armed American fighters transforms Japanese operational planning. Bomber formations that once operated with minimal escort now require extensive fighter protection that Japan no longer has capacity to provide. Transport aircraft become too vulnerable to operate in daylight. Training flights move farther inland, away from coastal areas where American fighters prowl. The entire Japanese air defense system reconfigures around avoiding combat with rocket-armed American fighters, which means effectively conceding air superiority. By mid-1945, American aircraft operate over Japan with near impunity, facing anti-aircraft fire but minimal fighter opposition. The few Japanese fighters that still fly operate under conditions where survival is measured in sorties, not months or years. Many pilots die on their first or second mission. The technological evolution continues even as the war enters its final months. American engineers develop improved variants: rockets with proximity fuses that explode automatically when near a target, rockets with larger warheads, rockets with better ballistic characteristics. These improvements matter little in practical terms. The original HVAR is already more than adequate for destroying any aircraft, but they reflect the American industrial philosophy that treats technological development as a continuous process. The Japanese, meanwhile, cannot even maintain production of basic fighters. By July 1945, Japanese aircraft factories produce primarily crude wooden fabric aircraft designed for kamikaze missions, aircraft that require minimal metal and can be built by semi-skilled labor. These aircraft have no radios, minimal instruments, and just enough fuel to reach their targets. They represent the endpoint of attrition warfare against an enemy with unlimited resources. Takashi Yamamoto, recovering in a military hospital from injuries sustained during his forced landing, listens to radio broadcasts describing American firebombing raids over Japanese cities. He knows the war is lost, has known since March 18 when those rockets erased his belief in Japanese tactical superiority. The knowledge is painful not merely because of military defeat but because of what that defeat implies about the ideology he has served. Bushido philosophy teaches that spirit trumps material, that Japanese warriors with pure hearts can overcome any physical disadvantage. The VARs prove this teaching false. No amount of spirit allows a Zero to outrun a rocket. No purity of heart protects against high explosive. The Americans have won not because their spirits are stronger, but because their factories are more productive, their engineers more innovative, their logistics more effective. They have won through the very materialistic advantages that Japanese propaganda insisted were weaknesses of decadent democracies. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 represent, in some sense, simply the next logical step in the progression that began with VARs. If one rocket can destroy one aircraft, why not develop a single bomb that can destroy an entire city? The conceptual leap is enormous, but the philosophical trajectory is consistent. American victory achieved through technological supremacy applied with industrial-scale abundance. The atomic bombs end the war, but for Japanese fighter pilots like Takashi, the war ended months earlier when they encountered weapons they could not fight, could not evade, could not overcome through skill or courage or sacrifice. Post-war analysis by American and Japanese military historians examines the VAR's impact through different lenses. American studies focus on tactical effectiveness, kill ratios, sortie efficiency, cost-benefit analysis. The rockets emerge as one of the war's most cost-effective weapons, relatively cheap to manufacture, simple to deploy, devastatingly effective. Japanese studies focus more on psychological impact, on how VARs contributed to the collapse of fighter pilot morale and the turn toward kamikaze tactics. Both perspectives are valid. The rockets were simultaneously a tactical weapon and a psychological weapon, destroying aircraft and destroying belief in the possibility of victory. The post-war interviews with surviving Japanese pilots reveal a consistent theme: the sound. The sound of VARs launching, a sharp crack followed by the rushing roar of rocket motors, became a sound associated with death. Pilots describe hearing that sound in dreams, in quiet moments, in the screaming of tea kettles. The auditory memory persists decades after visual memories fade. This makes sense from a psychological perspective. Vision in combat situations is consciously focused, attention directed at immediate threats. Hearing is passive, automatic, processed at subconscious levels. The sound of HVAR launches imprinted itself on neural pathways as an association with imminent death, bypassing conscious filtering. The sound became a Pavlovian trigger for terror responses. The launch rails remain, in these accounts, the visual symbol that encapsulates American technological dominance. The rails themselves are mechanically simple, tubular guides with electrical contacts for ignition. But what they represent is complex: an industrial base that can produce sophisticated weapons in vast quantities, an engineering establishment that can design and deploy new weapon systems in months rather than years, a military logistics network that can distribute these weapons to thousands of aircraft across the entire Pacific theater. When Takeshi Yamamoto saw those rails beneath the Corsair's wings, he was seeing more than a weapon mounting. He was seeing the physical manifestation of American material superiority, the hardware expression of an industrial economy that Japan could never hope to match. The comparison with Japanese weapon development is instructive. Japan did develop innovative weapons during the war: the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, the I-400 class submarine aircraft carriers, various suicide weapons. But these innovations were singular achievements, often produced in small numbers, rarely deployed with decisive effect. Japan lacked the industrial depth to move from prototype to mass production, lacked the resources to equip large forces with new weapons. Japanese innovation occurred in isolated laboratories and produced marvelous machines that arrived too late and in too few numbers. American innovation occurred across an entire industrial base and produced adequate weapons that arrived in overwhelming quantities. The HVAR was not technologically marvelous. It was an explosive warhead mounted on a solid-fuel rocket motor, both mature technologies. What made it devastating was that America produced them by the millions and deployed them on hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. The wing-mounted rocket rails, bolted beneath the wings of Corsairs and Hellcats across the Pacific, transformed aerial combat from a contest of skill to a contest of resources. Japanese pilots who had spent years perfecting their craft, learning the delicate art of aerial gunnery and maneuver combat, discovered that their skills had become obsolete. The Americans did not need to outfly them or outshoot them. The Americans simply needed to get close enough to fire rockets, and then probability handled the rest. This represented a philosophical shift in warfare, from artistry to engineering, from individual skill to systematic efficiency. It was a shift that reflected broader American military philosophy, the same philosophy that approached the European theater through massive logistics networks and overwhelming material superiority. The Japanese recognition of this shift contributed to the final desperate months of the war, when Japan abandoned conventional military strategy entirely and embraced kamikaze tactics as the only remaining option. If American fighters could not be fought conventionally, if American rockets made aerial combat into a one-sided slaughter, then perhaps the aircraft itself should become the weapon. Kamikaze attacks were suicidal, but they at least gave Japanese pilots agency in their deaths. Dying in a rocket explosion felt random, uncontrolled, meaningless. Dying while deliberately crashing into an enemy ship felt purposeful, honorable, consistent with Bushido values. The logic was desperate and ultimately futile. Kamikaze attacks, while psychologically traumatic for American sailors, did not change the strategic situation, but it represented the only tactical adaptation available to pilots facing weapons they could not otherwise combat. The production numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1944, Japan produced approximately 28,000 military aircraft of all types. In the same year, the United States produced approximately 96,000 military aircraft. But these numbers understate the disparity because they treat all aircraft as equivalent. A Japanese aircraft in 1944, built with increasingly scarce materials and increasingly unskilled labor, has markedly lower quality and reliability than its 1941 equivalent. An American aircraft in 1944, benefiting from years of production experience and continuous engineering refinement, is significantly better than its 1941 equivalent. Moreover, the American aircraft arrive at frontline units fully equipped with radios, radar, sophisticated gun sights, and for fighters, 8 VARs. The Japanese aircraft arrive, if they arrive at all, with minimal equipment and no advanced weapons. The numerical disparity of 3-to-1 becomes an effectiveness disparity of perhaps 10-to-1 or greater. Takeshi Yamamoto, released from military service after Japan's surrender, returns to a civilian life in a nation transformed by defeat. He becomes an agricultural engineer, works on reconstruction projects, never speaks publicly about his wartime experience for 20 years. When he finally agrees to an interview in 1965, he speaks carefully, choosing words with precision. "The Americans did not defeat us through superior spirit," he says. "They defeated us through superior production. The rockets beneath their wings, those were not merely weapons. They were symbols of an economy that could create anything in any quantity. We were fighting the wrong war. We were fighting as if Bushido spirit could overcome industrial capacity. It cannot. The rockets proved this every day. You could not meditate your way past a rocket traveling faster than sound. You could not use willpower to dodge an explosion that bracketed your entire flight path. The Americans won because they understood warfare as engineering problem requiring systematic solution. We understood warfare as spiritual test requiring absolute commitment. Both perspectives have validity, but in industrial warfare, engineering trumps spirit. The rockets taught us this lesson. We paid a terrible price for that education. The HVAR faded from American military service surprisingly quickly after the war. Jet aircraft, air-to-air missiles, and nuclear weapons dominated post-war development. The rockets appeared briefly in Korea, used primarily for ground attack, then vanished from the inventory as more sophisticated guided missiles replaced them. By the 1960s, the HVAR existed only in military museums and in the memories of those who had fired them or faced them. But the tactical doctrine they pioneered, using standoff weapons to destroy enemy aircraft before traditional dogfighting range, became foundational to modern air combat. Today's air-to-air missiles, launched from beyond visual range, descending on targets with speeds that make evasion nearly impossible, are the direct descendants of those wing-mounted rockets that terrified Japanese pilots in 1945. The epilogue to this story plays out in quiet conversations, in veterans' meetings, in historical conferences where former enemies meet as old men and discuss the war with the distance that decades provide. At one such conference in 1985, Takashi Yamamoto meets John Henderson, a former Marine Corsair pilot who flew missions over Kyushu in 1945. They share memories, compare experiences. Henderson describes the first time he fired VARs in combat, how the smoke and recoil surprised him, how the weapon seemed almost unfairly powerful. Yamamoto describes watching the rockets approach, the helpless terror of knowing death was coming faster than reaction allowed. They speak as professionals, analyzing tactics and weapons effects. But beneath the professional discussion runs a current of deeper recognition. Both men were participants in a historical transformation, the moment when aerial warfare moved from artistry to engineering, from individual skill to systematic destruction. The wing-mounted launch rails, preserved in aviation museums, look innocuous now. Simple metal tubes bolted beneath wings, electrical wiring running to firing mechanisms, placards explaining specifications and combat use. Museum visitors, most of whom have never experienced combat, walk past these exhibits with mild interest. The rails look primitive compared to modern weapon systems, almost crude in their mechanical simplicity. What the exhibits cannot convey is the psychological weight these devices carried for the men who faced them, the way those simple tubes represented the transformation of warfare, the death of certain comforting myths about how wars are won. For Takashi Yamamoto and the thousands of Japanese pilots who survived encounters with VARs, the rockets represented something beyond tactical defeat. They represented the demolition of an ideology, the proof that material abundance matters more than spiritual purity, that industrial capacity trumps warrior ethos, that democracy's messy productivity defeats totalitarianism's regimented efficiency. These were painful lessons, purchased with the lives of tens of thousands of Japanese pilots who flew into combat knowing they faced weapons they could not defeat. The white smoke trails of HVAR launches, arcing across Pacific skies in 1945, traced not merely ballistic trajectories but the collapse of Japanese military ideology. The sky over Kyushu is peaceful now, crossed by commercial airliners rather than fighters, the only smoke trails those of jet contrails catching the light at sunset. But in the memory of those who flew those skies 80 years ago, the smoke trails remain, white and deadly, moving too fast to evade, carrying within them the lesson that courage cannot defeat engineering, that spirit cannot overcome production, that the future belongs not to those who glorify sacrifice but to those who systematically eliminate the need for it. The wing-mounted rockets taught this lesson with brutal efficiency, and the lesson, once learned, could never be unlearned. The rails beneath the wings wait in museums, silent now, their rockets long since fired or disassembled. But they remain as testament to a truth that transcends any single war, that the distance between ideology and victory is measured not in spirit but in production capacity, not in willpower but in technological sophistication, not in the purity of belief but in the abundance of resources systematically applied. The Japanese pilots who faced those rockets learned this truth in the most visceral way possible, through survival or death, through the 2-second terror of watching explosive death approach faster than thought allows response. They learned it, and that learning changed not merely military doctrine but the fundamental understanding of what determines victory in modern warfare. The rockets are silent now, but their lesson echoes still.